So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Department of Gender Studies Welcome Lecture for the academic year 2022-23, titled African Feminisms for Abolitionist Futures, which is delivered by our very own Dr. S.M. Rodriguez. My name is Aiko Holvikivi. I'm an assistant professor in the department, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's event. And so this is a really wonderful event, first and foremost because it gives us the opportunity to learn more about Dr. Rodriguez's current work. And I will introduce that in a little bit more detail in just a moment, but just to note, as those of us with experience in academic publishing know, sometimes it can take years even for things to go from thoughts to writing to being published. So it's a real treat when our colleagues share what they're working on at the moment, so you heard it here first. But it's also a wonderful event because it gives us, as a department, a chance to come together as a community, right? So Welcome Week is always full of figuring out practical things, getting everybody settled in with their IT accounts and course choices, and all kinds of practical and incredibly important things, and you know, the inevitable hiccups that come when we do those. But in the midst of that, it's easy to start thinking about what we do in kind of transactional terms, you know, as setting up educational services, which of course is how a lot of the UK higher education sector works. But events like these remind us that we're also a community, and we're a political and intellectual community, which of course isn't the same as to say that we agree on what our political and intellectual investments are, but that we share a sense of community and we're committed to discussing and debating them together. And it's also an opportunity to come together as a social community, which is why we always have a reception right after the welcome lecture, which you're all warmly welcome to. And this will be in the old building, which is just kind of across in the square. Many of you have been there today. It's on the 5th floor in the senior common room from 5 p.m. But before we get to those refreshments for our bodies, we're going to be treated to some refreshments for the mind and possibly also for the soul. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, who's a colleague, a friend, and a scholar whose work I've really come to admire. So our speaker today is Dr. S.M. Rodriguez, who is Assistant Professor of Gender, Rights, and Human Rights at the Department of Gender Studies. Before this appointment, Dr. Rodriguez was based in New York City in the United States as Assistant Professor of Critical Criminology and Director of LGBTQ+ Studies at Hofstra University, and they also previously lectured at Stony Brook University and the State University of New York. And so SM's work is primarily concerned with the themes and dynamics of sex, racialization, and punishment. They take an anti-carceral, Black, and trans-feminist approach to interrogate sex as a projection onto the body as well as an activity, especially as related to criminal law and so-called correctional practices. Their work navigates these central interests from a global and transnational perspective, with particular attention to African diasporic people and places. SM has published extensively, writing books, through activist projects, and in academic journals such as GLQ, a Journal of Gay and Lesbian Studies, and Contemporary Sociology, to name just a few works of a prolific scholar. In terms of empirical sites, SM's first book, The Economies of Queer Inclusion, examines the effects of transnational activism on Ugandan LGBTI organizing during the 4-year period during which the Ugandan government was considering what was called the Kill the Gays Bill. The book received an honorable mention for the Distinguished Book Award by the American Sociological Association's Sexualities section last year. Their current research, in turn, interrogates these themes through an examination of penal abolition as a global social movement. They're currently working on a book titled On Abolition in the Academy, and today's talk focuses on what we can learn from African women, particularly those who've been imprisoned, about abolition as not just a goal, but in epistemology and ontology. So SM will speak for around 45 minutes, after which we're going to open the discussion to your questions and comments. And please be advised that we are recording this event. So SM, with that, I pass the floor to you.
Okay. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Aiko, for that lovely introduction. I had this moment, I think, because we've been online and, for a few years of just kind of sitting on this side of you, and I had this urge to take a picture of this view, and I feel like that would be awkward. I also don't have a phone on me, so I've missed the opportunity, but I wanted to voice that. All right, I'm just gonna jump right in. So, African feminisms for abolitionist futures. We'll see how this works out. Sit up straight. Perhaps, when la mulâtresse solitude decides to fight, she holds her ballooning belly and hums a song of liberty to her unborn child. Guadeloupe has known freedom from enslavement for 8 years due to the law of 4th of February, 1794, and yet Napoleon has decided to reinstate African enslavement to the benefit of French planters. Solitude, however, is known to be a maroon. While she was born into slavery, she lives her teens and adult years as a fugitive in a settlement away from the island's sugar and coffee plantations. But Napoleon's nearing navy carries the promise of chattel slavery for those racialized as black, threatening all but the planters on the island. Solitude's refusal for the return to slavery manifests in a steadfast determination to raise arms. Pregnant, she fights alongside Louis Delclé, her revolutionary rage sparking legends. Before the insurgency ends, Solitude and the Black rebels blast gunpowder stores, desperate for a lasting freedom in life or in death. Unlike most others, she survives, is captured and imprisoned. Solitude becomes immortal at the age of 30, giving birth in prison a day before execution. While the French colonizers only imagined black value in relationship to the imperial economy, saving her son for the promise of extractive value as an enslaved commodity, maroon knowledge leads us to imagine Black Lives Matter for the very fact of being. It is this epistemology, this fugitive knowledge, that brings us to the time-defying, context-expanding abolitionist imagination. Just like the call for abolition, la mulâtresse has only multiplied. She stands as statues in Guadeloupe and more recently in France. The Parisian monument to Solitude was birthed in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter's rallies throughout Europe and the United States to rid itself of colonial nostalgia erected as statues of enslavers, imperialists, and brutalists. The toppling of public commemorative displays follows movements such as Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa, and globally witnessed events such as the 2018 toppling of Mahatma Gandhi statue monument in Accra, Ghana, by university students critical of his historical anti-Black racism. In strong contrast to the public recognition or celebration of European colonial heritage, Solitude's defiant posture offers young abolitionists the possibility of imagining a lasting resistance. The international Black Lives Matter movement impacted the rebirth of Solitude's story in Paris in 2022, after years of struggle as a movement that began in 2013, yet relies on the life worlds built by centuries for a struggle for African sovereignty, life, and joy. I believe much can be told through Solitude's haunting half-life. The abolitionist spirit revives through movement organizations such as Black Lives Matter, which dedicates its website to, quote-unquote, imagining abolition. It endeavors to raise the consciousness of the possibility of sustaining life amid death worlds, but also to tending to to ending the death world rendered by carcerality. And by death worlds, I refer to the concept within Achille Mbembe's necropolitics that describes the new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life, conferring upon them the status of living dead. They are physical, political, and social formations that subject African people to perpetual loss, injury, and early death. And I use death worlds as a speculative geography, a way to remap our connections away from the merely physical realities of land masses and oceans, away from the nationalist imagination of borders. The current penal abolitionist movement is one such struggle against the death world, focusing primarily on prisons, policing, medicalized and psychiatric incarceration, border patrol, and encampment. Many within the movement situate these deadly spaces and practices in a time continuum of enslavement and coloniality. These are just images. I'm actually not going to get into them, but if you end up having questions about anything that shows up, you just bring it up at the end, okay? I'll just say with these, Elmina Castle and Fort William, these are both former slave fortresses, places in which captured people would be stored before being transported. And you'll see with Fort William, it was converted to a prison in the 1960s. So both the prison and the notion of a universal womanhood exist as colonial inventions, dually repressing African women's liberatory practice. While numerous historical studies demonstrate that pre-colonial Africa featured gender diversity in political structures like the female king of Igbo land or armies of women in Dahomey, coloniality introduced a limited conceptualization of womanhood. And that narrow womanhood is a contingent invention of Western patriarchal epistemes, which has then been extended in conceptualizing a liminal public-private subjectivity of African political womanhood. And within that, I'm using a concept of African political womanhood by Marciana Were. And this womanhood rests not just on the political binary of a public-private sphere, but on a socially enforced sex binary that invisibilizes and harms countless people who were born with chromosomal or genital difference as their intersex, or who reject the assignment of one sex or gender to transition to any other as they are transgender. The ultimate purpose of the social construction of gender difference is not just social control, whereby the world is divided neatly into two classes of people for the sake of order, but also domination. In the context of African political womanhood, this plays out in the post-colonial project of nation building, which silences the political presence of the feminized. In this talk, I treat prisons as a threat to Black social, political, and physical life, and ask how we can recenter the transnational legacy of African women's resistance to better understand their contribution to today's abolitionist imagination. More pointedly, I ask that we collectively think about how African women's movement in presence, in spirit, and philosophy inspires the movements of others today. The history of the prison itself is deeply intertwined with colonial administration and systems of control. The invention of prisons in Africa were, quote, part of the machinery of the brutal slave economy, not as an agency of the criminal justice system, but as a tool for organized crimes against humanity. That's by Biko Agwazina. Just sitting here with these images for that statement. Prisons are crucial to maintaining the imperial and neo-imperial economy as the forced labor within sustains war and reinforces the coloniality of race and gender. The mushrooming of the total institution works to regularly employ banishment from the community or social execution, which during pre-colonial times would have been a last resort rather than a default response to social offenses. For African women around the world, incarceration rates have risen sharply and often rely on allegation and indigence rather than any actual infraction of the law. However, laws are also created specifically around a racialized and gendered notion of order, ever expanding in order to ensnare those of African descent. Therefore, we must be deeply critical of the function of prisons in society and the global commitment to social control through carcerality. In Our Prisons Obsolete, Angela Davis asserts that gender structures the prison. The very design, the function, and the logic of prisons are set upon gendered ideologies that emphasize a natural binary, imbue privilege assumptions, and form differentiated punishment for people coded men, women, or otherwise gender deviant. One such assumption embedded within the prison structure is that normal, or quote-unquote natural, women are less inclined to engage in criminalized behavior. This assumption leads to the pathologization of the few who end up incarcerated, particularly the poor, the queer, the sexual, and the racialized. It also encourages different, quote-unquote, reformational actions as corrective control. These reformatory practices include homesteading, learning to cook and clean, tending to animals, laundry services, and learning to sew. All of these are embedded practices within prisons even today to teach women to be women and not criminals. And yes, air quotes there. However, we must ground rehabilitation in its necessary precursor of pathologization and understand that this means that punishment and incapacitation continue to exist if not supersede a reformatory logic. As such, rehabilitation often looks like forced psychiatrization and medicalizing women's reform. These medicines may create embodied prisons within the imprisoned body. To rehabilitate is to identify a fundamental unwellness, a wrongness in someone, and restore them to be the ableist, sexist, racist, ageist, imagined ideal version of themselves. It not only ignores structural conditions that lead to many criminalized actions, but it also displaces blame onto survivors of violence for their trauma. Doing time is meant to correct their behaviors, but not the societal cultures or conditions that reproduce harm, such as domestic abuse or rape culture or poverty. But notably, in a collectivist African sensibility, doing time also means suffering awayness. It can be understood as an irreparable severing from the sense of a collective self. Furthermore, women's imprisonment is incapacitative on various levels. First, to remove purportedly deviant women from society preserves the image and idea of the pure woman, and isolates surplus women from greater society during their potentially reproductive years. As such, anti-carceral feminists argue that societal disablement is a cyclical project. Structural neglect and carcerality exist outside of the prison and then funnel women into the further disabling environment of the prison. They are then ejected, traumatized back into society, less able to live fulfilling and dignified lives, and continuously subjected to collateral consequences. Therefore, many argue that women's imprisonment supports the aims of eugenics, removing the racialized, poor, queer, and disabled from the public in the short term, and also in a progressive eugenicist sense from the population. This argument is only supported by the critical scholarship into practices of abortion or forced sterilization or prenatal or antenatal neglect in carceral facilities. However, in a more general sense, we must understand that women's imprisonment serves to stop the unruly African from challenging the social order of white supremacy. This social death or expulsion from humanity is a facet of necropolitics that we need to resituate in understanding the strategic silencing of women of African descent. While this argument is well worn in literature about men as political prisoners, women are often excluded from the perspective and the study. Recentering African political womanhood brings us to a different analysis of carceral repression and gender. As Ife Amadiumi informs, Igbo womanhood was initially curious to the colonial eye due to women's steadfast political participation and revolt. African womanhood does not and has never meant docility. African women have historically played very crucial political roles in defying imperialism, in creating public knowledge, and in resisting nationalist repression. Reconciling this truth with the facts of women's imprisonment as a reflection of the political project of enforcing a sex binary brings us to question imprisonment as always political, always about maintaining a social order that favors coloniality. Eslanda Goodrobeson writes, and this is in 1954, but it's a quote that I love. When I was a little girl, I used to think that only criminals, bad, wicked, evil people, dangerous to the community were put in jail. Now I'm a woman grown, living in a rapidly changing world. I know that very often, very good, very wonderful people are put in jail because they are dangerous. Not to the community, but to the few, sometimes very wicked and corrupt people who are in power. As such, I give this talk to re-articulate danger through an African abolitionist perspective. If our political sensibilities are a danger to the neo-colonial order, then prisons function not to protect us from danger, but as a management scheme in response to us as politically dangerous beings. Whether this is a politic of the wayward, which is a concept by Saidiya Hartman, you all will be familiar quite soon, or of the imprisoned intellectual or revolutionary, which is a concept from Joy James, or of the gender disruptor, the mission remains. Only connection will serve our collective freedom. Methodologically, I consider the autobiographies and poetry of Africa-descended women who have been imprisoned on and away from the continent. And for this research, the research that this talk is based on, I emphasize the existence of a colonial carceral diaspora, from which African women developed counter-narrative practices to reject colonialism, apartheid, and post-independence autocracy. For the term colonial carceral diaspora, I take inspiration from the earlier work of Mekenagel, who argued that the United States had created a new diaspora of prison cages by trafficking African descendants from prison to prison, already historically displaced through trafficking for slavery. By focusing in part on the literature crafted by political prisoners, which Carol Boyce Davies calls the resistance literature of women, the work reveals how they challenge foreign domination, but also the internal struggles against patriarchal domination and class oppression. And because I'm interested in the overlap of experience and expression despite time, I write these struggles in the present tense. For me, this is both an Afrofuturist and Black feminist ontological endeavor. Jaeli Sayers points to Afrofuturism as an imaginative project that creates a less constrained future for African people, while reorienting Black Atlantic temporality toward both the production of futures and the development of counter-memory. So it's a cumulative time, rather than a passing time. Similarly reimaginative of the essence of time, Vivian Salehana charts out Black feminist ontology, which describes the ever-changing formations of anti-colonial resistance as transcendent and metamorphical, shape-shifting. Although white supremacist institutions harm us, Black feminism haunts white supremacy. The ontological quality of my analysis rests in the destabilization of time and lifespan. The afterlives of these women and their works timelessly display the power to affect and unsettle the colonial carceral diaspora. I write of women because they're often unmentioned when referencing political imprisonment. However, the unrelenting nature of their activism and their particular insights from incarceration make them critical actors to understand. The revolutionaries all continue to name the roots of oppression and call for radical collectivity against the co-constitutive white supremacist forces of imperialism, cis-heterosexism, racism, capitalism, ism. The narratives of their incarceration interweave the complex harms, physical, spiritual, material, and sexual, that shape racialized and sexed subjection. More grippingly, the perseverance of their messages, which defy temporal bounds and spatial borders, inspire the future of abolitionist movements globally. In Notting Hill, London, Steel pans are beaten by African immigrants from the Caribbean islands. The joyous music moves through and rises above a crowd of over 1 million celebratory carnival goers. Its rhythm migrates from West Africa to Trinidad and the Southern Caribbean, to England, surviving generations of force, desperation, and deportation. And so too does Claudia Jones. When she founds the event, she writes, "A people's art is the genesis of their freedom." And she imagines that the police brutality, the white supremacy, and the brutal capitalism and imperialism of England can be brought down by a united African peoples. In this image, Claudia is on the far right, whereas Eswanda Goodrosen is the one actually speaking. Claudia, who is born in Port of Spain, Trinidad, begins the West Indian Gazette in London after she's deported from New York City. And just a really interesting note, she's deported to London. She's actually born in Trinidad, right? The idea around that was that she was actually too dangerous to send back, politically dangerous to send back, and that by sending her here to London, perhaps her mutinous spirit could be quelled. And, you know, she had another thing coming. England did, indeed. So as many freedom fighters of African descent in the 19th and 20th centuries, Claudia is a communist. And her indefatigable organizing power and political presence in the States leads her to serve time for the Alien Registration Act, a law in place to criminalize advocating the overthrow of the US government. Between the carcerality of poverty, gender, and disability, her actual incarceration, she lives in an archipelago of carceral cells. She's ordered to be deported under the Subversive Activities Control Act of 1950, and in her words, she owes her deportation to the McCarthyite hysteria against independent political ideas in the US, a hysteria which penalizes anyone who holds ideas contrary to the official pro-war, pro-reactionary, pro-fascist line of the white ruling class. Her words, not mine. The hearings occur, as she's twice held, between 1948 and 1950 at Ellis Island, a federally owned immigration detention island overlooked by the Statue of Liberty. That level of irony. Between the hearings and her deportation, she enters a 7-year cycle of arrest, hospitalization, commutation, or bail-based release. And her heart begins to fail before she reaches 40 years old. Beyond the bars and the bail and her breaking heart, her spirit triumphs, indomitable. And she writes poetry while incarcerated. While this I know, my heart rebels at screens that shut off sunlight's beams. My thoughts rise too like tinkling bells, to welcome shafts of light in seams. Ere as I write, bright ways peep through. Their fiercer power pierce this dew, strength born of atoms held at bay, simulation of men's will to cast all doubt away. And as such, Claudia Jones etches herself into the archive as a force of nature. Her will simulates sun rays and illuminates a path forward, beyond the structures that encage her body. Her poetry reflects various themes like solidarity with other activist women, the meaning of the Atlantic, human existence, political commitment, and exile and placelessness. Only months after her incarceration at Alderson Federal Prison Camp, the very place where Assata Shakur later sits, she arrives in England, the last island she will live on in her physical lifetime. And like her fellow imprisoned poet, Assata, Jones spends her life writing for personal and collective survival, and the future survival of the movement indeed hinges upon her contribution to the archive. The West Indian Gazette becomes known as the first major black magazine in England, publishing on Afro-Asian Caribbean news and politics of liberation globally and locally. Claudia and her team of editors, including Amy Ashwood Garvey, Marcus Garvey's first wife, maintained the monthly publication for 6 years between its founding and Claudia's early earthly departure. However, Claudia's presence remains through the sound system staged in Notting Hill on the first day of Carnival after the global pandemic of COVID-19. Like Claudia, who passed early at the juncture of structural neglect and disability, the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately impacted people of African descent in England. And when August comes around and it's time for the parade, festival goers crowd together, mixing the spirit of Claudia's message. When slow death is most apparent, so too must be our resilience and joy. Beyond the foreground of the many smiling faces, of dancing children playing mass, many points of Westbourne Park Road display spray-painted messages of justice. In the background, justice for Grenfell, justice for George Floyd. Note for anybody not, who's new to London, Grenfell refers to a housing block called Grenfell Towers that suffered a historic fire in 2017. Over 70 people died from that, and 85% of those people were people of color. It was the worst residential fire in the UK since World War II. But just to note. Just to note that juxtaposition, I guess. In the Black feminist mind, these messages are intimately connected. As Audre Lorde writes, specifically to white women on the social importance of recognizing difference, quote, raising Black children in the mouth of a racist, sexist, suicidal dragon is perilous and chancy. If they cannot love and resist at the same time, they probably will not survive. Joy, love, and solidarity are all necessary displays of resistance that sustain Black life. And Claudia knows this as she breathes life into Carnival in a small hall in the dead of winter in London, because the first one was actually in December. And it was a necessary and urgent joy crafted in response to police and white supremacist violence in her new home that she was sharing with windrushers. When I cross Claudia's Carnival streets and the spray-painted pleas for justice, the political work of another prison poet comes to mind, scholar-activist Stella Nyanzi. Feminist anthropologist, LGBTQ organizer, and adroit wordsmith, Stella currently resides in Germany after de facto exile from her home in Uganda. Born in Jinja, Uganda, Stella has similarly managed a borderless impact. Her internationally published and cited academic work focuses on sexuality, power, and culture, and her gendered criticisms about governmental neglect and misuse of authority earn her both respect and hatred. Stella's protests and quote-unquote cyber harassment charge lead to her imprisonment in Luzera Women's Prison, which is the image here. While pregnant and imprisoned, Stella faces hostility from corrections officers in Uganda. However, unlike Asada, who I referenced several times in this, and you know what, we can talk about her if you'd like to, but I don't go into depth. But unlike Asada, she never receives the antenatal care, and she actually loses her baby in prison, who she decides to name Justice. Stella is particularly outspoken about the shortcomings of the Ugandan government, especially in relationship to feminized and queer people. And for this, she's faced considerable violence, including being arrested for her written, enacted, and embodied protests. Her direct action, spoken addresses, and protest poetry are described to fit radical rudeness, an anti-colonial resistance tactic where rebels are deliberately rude, disorderly, intemperate, and obnoxious as a way of disrupting existing social rituals and systems in colonial times. She names the role of criminalisation in sequestering the poor and the political woman in her book of poetry, No Roses from My Mouth. Stella's critiques of the Ugandan president and his wife are criminalized as offensive communication and cyber harassment. obviously new laws in Uganda. She, like many of the imprisoned, is punished by the collateral consequences of criminal labeling. And beyond imprisonment, she's ostracized, subjected to material penalties, and forced to suffer incalculable loss. And outside of the text of her writing, it is the solidarity of the Ubuntu reading group that ensures that her story survives and breaks through imprisonment as they smuggle her text out of prison. In No Roses from My Mouth, Stella writes, "Teach the nation poetry. Deployments of anti-riot police cannot shoot tear gas at rhymes, nor disperse the rhythm of our poems. Teach the nation poetry. Forgotten masses will pack our pain in stanzas that will pierce the core of the tyranny. Raw poems hit harder than your platitudes. Teach the nation poetry. Handcuffs cannot contain the potency of poems. Arrest warrants cannot disappear memorized verse. Poetry can never be detained in jail." Her words, her spirit, and the connections she has made exist beyond the institutions of harm to which her physical body is consigned, because in her words, poems will transport us to freedom. As such, Stella realizes her own writing in a historic lineage of African activism against political repression. If liberationist action is to be forcibly segregated, silenced, and left to disappear in the criminalized death world, then she writes to immortalize thought in virtual publication, where its immateriality allows it to reach a greater collective. Stella's book of poetry importantly turns us toward the generative imagining of sisterhood that relies upon collectivity and solidarity to survive death worlds. Sisterhood is forged on that prison floor, she writes. In the account of her harrowing loss of justice, she writes of her imprisoned fellows who shielded her from the jeers of corrections officers during her miscarriage. It's the fellows, the other imprisoned women, who redistribute their scarce material goods to contain her bleeding and protect her well-being. We're told in the book, "One prisoner gives me a sanitary pad, another prisoner gives me her panties, yet another gives me toilet tissue. Prisoners protect my privacy. Prisoners hold up blankets as shields around me." In this context, we're brought to understand the dire need for relationships of solidarity, both inside prisons and those that extend past bars and borders for urgent mutual aid, for harm reduction, and for a real end to practices of deprivation for political correction. Both Stella's life and her storytelling invite us to envision the Black feminist scholarly project as connected in spirit to that of the activist, liberationist, and incarcerated intellectual. Her subversive connection-making includes the sexual and romantic connections that sustain her humanity while she's encaged. She writes, "Stolen kisses between women prisoners make us human, not immoral." And as such, it's the kiss and touch of other people marked as women that tide her over through the waves of alienation and dehumanization. Therefore, her writing reveals several truths. The structural neglect and colonial logic required to imprison anyone at all. An exhausting but not exhaustive range of harms that form corrective violence. And lastly, the collective effort required to rehumanize those dehumanized. A song that I really like by Lauryn Hill. I find it hard to say. She says, "We must destroy in order to rebuild. Wake up. You might as well. Are you satisfied? Rebel." The African diaspora begins as a story of forced migration, labor, racial identification, but it lives as a story of resistance and connection. While the markers of force have shifted rather than died, the resistance and connection have only amplified. What Solitude, Claudia, and Stella offer us is a look at how resistance moves across borders. Even when meant to be defeated or deported, the revolutionary spirit lives. It mushrooms in exile. To return to Vivian Salehana's words, African women's political struggle does not experience death at all, but rather it haunts white supremacy. What this haunting gifts us is the vision, truth, and possibility of abolition. According to Dylan Rodriguez, Abolition is a dream toward futurity vested in insurgent, counter-civilizational histories, genealogies of collective genius that perform liberation under conditions of duress. For Liat Ben Moshe, abolition requires a disepistemology, a letting go of attachments to clairvoyance and expertise and the hyper-specific and formulaic demands for replacement institutions. Those who have let go, who live renounced like maroons, hold transformative knowledge. As abolition requires the end of dehumanization, Wando Echebe reminds us of the Igbo saying, "He who will hold another down in the mud must stay in the mud to keep him down." She explains the revocation of someone's human rights forces an unaliving, unhumaning, unbeing unto them, which forces all, oppressed and oppressor, to lose the beauty of their being. We only reach our full humanity when we uphold and collaboratively sustain the humanness of others. As such, I look toward African indigenous epistemologies that have traveled and propagated possibilities for the humanity of others throughout the diaspora. The women discussed here demonstrate an abolitionist praxis and thought with never uttering the word abolition. They demand that we critically interrogate structural inequities. They position strategy and consideration alongside urgent action. They demonstrate uncompromising will. All insist upon fighting for collective liberation before the future outcome is settled or even imagined. Live free or die. The last words solitude is believed to have uttered. By connecting histories of incarcerated women of African descent, we begin to see the carceral project as a marker of coloniality. The surveillance, punishment, and segregation of women of African descent form an undrawn geography and unknowable temporality that connect the African diaspora in a death world and in cumulative time. With an anti-carceral feminist analysis, we can identify coloniality as not merely a moment of Western colonialism, the time in which Claudia Jones or L'Homme de Solitude lived, but also our current material and political reality. The prison built to encage Stella's political power, the criminal law meant to protect Western-backed presidents from offensive communication, the pathologies invented to suppress women's political participation, all exist as markers of the colonial carceral. This analysis in positioning Stella alongside Claudia and L'Homme de Solitude destabilizes time in service of exploring the living, the undead, and the yet born. The spirit of African political womanhood bounds beyond borders and collectivizes strength for generations. It is transnationally marked in poetry and in sculpture. These women connect an archipelago of cells with unified resolve because, as Claudia says, what is an ocean between us? We know how to build bridges. In this essence, the subject of analysis is not merely the internationalization of anti-Black oppression through the transatlantic slave trade, Western colonialism, and imprisonment. Instead, it's the messaging, objectives, and forms of collectivization demonstrated by African political womanhood, particularly those surviving imprisonment in the colonial carceral diaspora. Their survival stories ask us to reckon with what lives and what travels in a broader sense than the physical body. While the death worlds of segregation, forced labor, and imprisonment operate to silence African women through pathologization and criminalization, the methods of revolutionary organizing birth life worlds. These methods include direct action, feminist theorization, fugitive collectivization, and creative writing for consciousness raising. So as I learned from Black women abolitionists, who learned from Black women abolitionists, who love Assata Shakur very specifically, it is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Thank you.
thank you so much for that incredible and browsing talk. I know I have a lot of questions and things I would like you to discuss further, but I thought we have around half an hour or so for Q&A, up to that amount of time, and I thought I would see first if anybody wants to jump right in with their questions, comments, thoughts.
Hi, I just want to say, first off, thank you so much for that wonderful lecture and for highlighting so many incredible transnational conversations. So you spoke in a couple of points during your lecture about connections between carcerality and reproductive justice, specifically around issues such as forced sterilization and lack of prenatal care. As abortion rights are more largely reproductive justice, it's getting a lot of attention in current conversations of, especially feminist service. I wonder if you might be able to touch briefly, unless it's too broad of a topic, on what current, pro-choice, pro-abortion rights conversations must learn and incorporate from Black feminist leaders and their teachings.
Sorry, I should have led with that. Can I ask you to introduce yourselves when you speak?
Sorry, my name's Emily. I'm originally from Ottawa, Canada.
Are you collecting questions?
Or shall we collect questions? Should we collect a couple?
I will take it, actually, because I think there's a threat. If questions are all as good as this one, that I'm going to just lose track of them. And so, yeah, let me just briefly maybe answer that. Thank you so much for that question and for even extracting that from the talk. I think that that's a really incredible point to bring out and to kind of prompt me to think through a little bit better myself. So I think one thing that's very important perhaps to take away from the conversations around carcerality, right? Or some of the kind of Black feminist, anti-carceral feminist conversations, right, where that connects, is to understand carcerality not as synonymous with imprisonment, right, but actually a logic and a practice of surveillance, right, of control, of discipline for a larger reason, right? And so within that, when we think about reproductive rights, right, when we think about reproductive justice, I think that you have to balance different conversations at one time, right, about autonomy, about what people do with their bodies, but also about the state's various investments in controlling who reproduces and who doesn't, right? And what kind of state mechanisms arise in order to intervene and perhaps make decisions around who reproduces. And so I think part of that conversation, I mean, if you want to sit with just Black feminism's kind of contributions to reproductive justice conversations, I think there are several theorists, even within this, that I had referenced, like Dorothy Roberts, who would have a lot to offer around maybe that connection between carcerality and eugenics, right? If you get to that conceptual link, the one that says we segregate people, we take people out of the population or in order to harm them, right? And we happen to do this, right, during reproductive years. we happen to do this to people who we don't want to reproduce or that we do imagine will be a burden, right? If you think of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's way of thinking about people who are imprisoned, it's about who is a surplus population. Who does the state not want to engage with at all, right? And so the whole reason for taking out certain people is to not have to account for their care, yeah? But also to make sure that they're not contributing, right, to the stressors on the economy. Okay, so I think if you take that kind of broader sense about what carcerality is, right, the logic, that is a eugenicist logic at the end of the day, right, and you merge that with the conversations around control, around family planning, or around perhaps even the opposite of the forced sterilizations, right, and you put these together, then you can kind of get at the conceptual root a little bit better. So I think even when this line, right, when the feminist line isn't necessarily speaking about reproduction in and of itself, that's not to say that their theories don't contribute really greatly to questions that we have about bodily autonomy. Thank you for asking it.
I had a hand in the front.
Yes. Hello, I'm Ekaterina from Georgia, and first of all, I'd like to thank you for a very interesting lecture. My question is about one problem we are facing, I can say nowadays as well, around the globe. It's about using psychiatric institutions or psychiatric care as a tool to represent a group of activists, women's activists or LGBTQI community as a people who need psychiatric care or institutionalization of these people in the institutions. So I wanted to ask you what you was talking about prisons and this tool to use against women activists, but what are the new tools today, like mailing them, sharing private videos, using psychiatric care? If you can share more examples of the tools used against women's activists. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So I think a lot of that is going to be specific to the context, right? When we think about imprisonment or repression, right, of women, of activist women, I think we do actually have to think about oftentimes the kind of what they often call development measures and markers of like a various kind of the various nations that you're considering, right? In a context like the United States or the United Kingdom, where pharmaceuticals, right, are everywhere, then you actually see the distribution of pharmaceuticals as a form of imprisonment within prisons, right? So you have places, especially women's prisons, where 90% of the people who are incarcerated are being regularly shoved pills, right, for one thing or another. I think that that's one kind of technology that is new, but it's also context specific. The root of that, right, the logic for that technology is not new. Pathologization, right, is something that has always kind of gone alongside various forms of segregation, but also have justified trying to stop people from seeking liberation, right? So activism in and of itself. I think other technologies that may be of interest, and I like that you're bringing out like even doxing as one of those. I think you can see a really wide range of kind of that marriage between like technology and punishment, right? And as applied to women, I think oftentimes that can look like doxing or releasing kind of information publicly about their like life, their accounts, etc. But I also think it can be hacking and leaking photographs of them. anything that compromises their reputation. There's also, I think on the state level, like explained for the context of selekniancy, there is the constant creation of new laws, and so that you can call more women criminals, right? Who's going to be disproportionately impacted by something like offensive communication, right? Maybe the people who you think shouldn't speak ever. You know, that has that has kind of some gendered and racialized assumptions within it. So I think, you know, if you think of technology in a kind of really expansive way, then you have to actually start to think through like something like pharmaceutical, but also, you know, the internet. Right? Thank you for asking.
I see several hands. Do you think we should start then?
Okay, let's start.
Okay, let's
I will
take
try my best.
let's take two to start out easy. So I see a hand in the middle there. Hi.
Hi, my name is Gila. I'm German originally. I'm from the Central Office Meeting. I was particularly interested about kind of when we talked about that loving each other and friendship and caring for each other and joy are like very important, like crucial to both abolitionist work and also cultural activism. So if you could say a little more about that would be really great. Like kind of how are these relationships develop, what spaces are they nurtured in, and I guess why are they so important, like why are they forms of activism in and of itself?
Thank you.
Yes. Hi.
My question is actually sort of similar, you know, that, because again, I noticed that you sort of mentioned love and a lot and solidarity and resistance. And I was wondering if you found in reading the work and the sort of art produced by the incarcerated women, if you found similarities in the way love was being defined and thought about, and different from sort of how we think about it in an everyday scenario.
We can do another since
Yeah.
we can have.
Okay. Should we take one more? There. Alia, hi.
My name is Alia. So, I guess I have both a question and a comment which are linked. And my question is, where would you place like internationalism in sort of in the way in which these revolutionaries live, they were inspired, and then they left the time? And I guess that's born from like a comment, and the comment is around like I'm sort of struck by some of the images that I saw with I think there was like highlighting African women calling for socialism, and you describing one of these women as being incarcerated for being communist. And because one of sort of the things that I end up feeling in like histories, particularly histories of like liberation and revolutionaries across the world are described, particularly in the anti-colonial era, like the piece around internationalism and how people and movements from across the global south, right, if, you know, and not just organize around region or around race, but how that period was truly like one of the things that distinguishes it from, I guess, what is called revolutionary practice today. It's like the absence of internationalism. And so I'm just curious about sort of how would you respond to sort of my comment, and how you think internationalism and how in particular sort of the connections between the internationalism of that time and the communist movement and socialism as like a living real revolutionary alternative that was alive at that time. It's still alive. I mean, I'm a communist, so it is still alive. But obviously it was very different. So yeah, sorry, it's a bit all like
Thank you. So two kind of big sets of questions around love and joy and internationalism.
Love, joy, and communism. Let's do it. Just another Wednesday. Yeah. Okay. Okay. love is a very easily manipulable concept, but it's such a powerful one, and I don't think you would find a sustained movement, much less a kind of one that's, you know, an evolving movement in this kind of like intergenerationally evolving movement, that you wouldn't find kind of love appearing within that literature. I think in the ways that I see love being thought through and written about, and within this, I'll draw mostly from Stella and Claudia, their writings, but I'm pulling from quite a few others. The way that I see love operating for people who are imprisoned is almost a form of daily sustenance on the kind of imaginative level, right? So it's operating just to get people through the day, right? Through this concept of doing time, through this social severance. It is also happening even in a fleeting way between, like, you know, the kind of connections that are being formed within prisons. And so I find particularly, there's a poem that Claudia writes for someone else who was imprisoned, who under a pseudonym, but she writes, I'm pretty sure it's Consuela, but she's like my anti-fascist love, right? And she just writes poetry for people in this way, right, where she's naming their connection as the whole reason for doing this, right? So it's like the way of making sense of what's happening to you, right? Even though you don't necessarily desire being there, you're there, and you have to face that reality of it. And I think that love is a part, like the love between imprisoned people is a part of what builds the kind of intellectual and radical drive, right, to imagine themselves, right, as important people as they are, but also contributing to an important shift. So I think there's that. And then the last one I'll say is that I'm thinking about a poem that Stella wrote that was titled Keen Love, and which is a name. And it was about this person, this genderqueer person who comes to visit her and is one of the only people who just regularly comes to visit. And she just writes about Keen Love's way of holding their body, of doing random kind of gender proselytizing to the people who work in the prison, like, you know, all of this, right? And I think my takeaway of that is, and I mean, you know what, well, I shouldn't speculate, we're being recorded. Okay, let me back up from there and say that I think one way or another, the connections that were formed between people who are inside and outside, right, play such an important role. And those are loving connections that actually take people or smuggle whatever's inside outside. So in the Assata Shakur case, this is actually, she was busted out of prison by people who loved her so much, right, that they freed her. But for Stella, that was, people took the scraps that she wrote on and smuggled it out, right? And she saw that as an act of love, right? It's an act of political love. So I think we have to think about it on kind of several levels. But I do think love, friendship, and joy are crucial to sustaining activism, both in that kind of like keeping people alive immediate way, but also in that long term, perhaps saving lives by changing and ridding, right, these institutions. In terms of where I would place internationalism, with this, I'm assuming we are operating very specifically from the place of, internationalism as a political commitment and philosophy that guides social movements, right? Particularly 20th century social movements. I guess with these three cases, there's only one person that I am dealing with that is a 20th century person, so I'll name that, in which her story is absolutely internationalist. Her activism is as well. The whole idea of overthrowing the US government is happening from within, but it's also about the relationships, the kind of conceptual relationships that she's forming between what's happening in the US and what's happening in other countries. Obviously, that also then plays a role when here in England, and then remaining connected to people of the various countries that she's committed to. But I would say more broadly speaking with internationalism, a reason why I think through the concepts in a more speculative geography than nations is because I don't think Africa is bound, and I don't think it should be bound. And I don't think that the way that people are acting, as in their activism, actually speaks so specifically to very particular nations, but rather is about, implies what can happen in other spaces, right? Liberation is not about this one place, it's always about an entire people's. And so that's a kind of more broad way of taking internationalism, but it's to say that, Africa, even continentally based, is always an international concept. The organizing, I can agree that perhaps we see a bit less of the maybe Huey P. Newton internationalist perspective now. But I would say that that's absolutely been revived in the 21st century, especially with internationalist organizations like Black Lives Matter. So I'm hopeful. I'm forever an optimist.
Thank you. More questions? So we have one from Claire, and we have one in the back. Radhika, shall we do three?
Go for it.
Claire, do you want to start?
Thanks so much for starting off the year so brilliantly and evocatively. That was lovely, thank you. I had a question. I was really struck by this teaching femininity in prisons and the images that you had, and linking that to your argument about colonial imposition of gender and sex categories. And then I was then interested in, of course, that frames what black feminism and black womanhood is in terms of its rebel nature and its failure to be incorporated and so on. And so I just had a question about whether or not you were going to look at some trans or non-binary poetry or autobiography, or whether for you that distinction is less important when you're thinking about trying to resist colonial gender and sex categories.
Great. We had a hand. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just kind of wanted to touch on what you said about like prison systems kind of perpetuating violence and being kind of a form of gender-based violence in itself. So I did a bit of work with like anti-violence movements back in Australia, and there is kind of that idea that we rely on, the movement relies so much on kind of the criminal justice system and violence against women.
having enough money to like help people who are experiencing violence right now? That's a very big question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You had promised to Radhika.
Hi, my name is Radhika, and my question was also related to violence. So when we were engaging with the third slide, this idea of home as a prison came to my mind. So there are a lot of women in my country who have to go through marital rape, gender-based violence, and because of the economic inability to free themselves from that space, they are in some sense imprisoned in that space. So what would you say about home in such a sense as a prison?
Thank you. Oh, I love this. Okay. This is so fun. Okay, so I'll start here. So I will admit I wrote 3 versions of this. I'm embarrassed. One that has way too many people, and it was awful. But it did have about 6 or 7 kind of cases, right? And I was just going for it. And that was scrapped. But 2 of those people were trans women. One of which is incarcerated right now in as of last month was released, I'll say, in Cameroon, and another in the US. I don't find the distinction between cis and trans women to be useful within this. I'll say the second iteration of the writing was actually just going to be trans women. And so I just pendulum swing all the time. So anyways, here we are, we're back here. I don't find the distinction actually to be useful in the analytic, because what happens when you integrate kind of conversation with trans women, non-binary people, intersex people, and cis women, is actually, it just becomes more robust. Like you see exactly how that gender, that gender structure is working, and you see at which point people are, I guess, in the ways, the technologies that the state uses to neutralize threat, right? Even in the case that I have talked about in the U.S. Is someone who was incarcerated, was moved because of quote-unquote progressive legislation, so moved to be incarcerated with cis women, right? And then actually impregnated a cis woman in prison, and so was removed from there and put into a men's prison. And so what you actually get when you think through, or what I get when I think through the relationship of different genders to imprisonment in this way, is actually seeing exactly how that, to go back to that first question about the reproductive elements, right, and the eugenicist logics, right, how that is working in prisons with the technologies of the new laws, the new policies, and also the failures of progressive reforms. I think really specifically come about when we continuously grapple with this question of, well, what prison should we put trans people in? Versus how do we not imprison people? Yeah, so I do think that it is really interesting. I think the gender disciplining actions are quite interesting, and what ends up happening is, rather than teaching the homesteading and the laundry services and whatnot, what we tend to see, of course, with trans women who are incarcerated with cis women is that they're disproportionately in segregated units, right? And so they're de facto kind of drawn out of those gender corrective devices, right? Just to go back to one of those images that you mentioned, this is actually the very, very first women's prison in the U.S. This is from 1873 is when they opened, and I found it actually University of Warwick collection. It's interesting because what was described, what was talked about when they wrote about this, because there's like a little kind of blog about Indiana Women's Prison that went with this. They did not mention race at all. This is the very, very first women's prison in the U.S., and every single one of them are black. And it's not because it was a segregated unit. It was literally that's who is in prison. And so thinking about, you know, this idea, this concept of black womanhood, right, as not a form of womanhood at all, right, one in which is meant to be kind of put into these segregated kind of spaces and taught womanhood, is one that I think becomes so apparent when we look at prison history. So thank you. I hope that gets to it at least a little bit, and I will send you the draft of the other one. Okay, so anti-violence relying on state funding. Okay, so you know what? It's actually quite interesting. I have one. That's great. I saw it on your face. You didn't even say it. Anti-violence relying on state funding. You know what? It's funny because anti-violence is a term that I use and kind of know very specifically outside of the state. So, I mean, there's violence against, right, there are things to stop or end violence against women, right? There are initiatives to end violence or to combat violence, which I think is really interesting terms. But anti-violence, at least how where I situate it, is actually in community organizations that are largely unfunded or underfunded. And I think some of this actually will speak to the, sorry, where was Radhika? There you are. To the homeless prison as well. A lot of what I see and what I think of with anti-violence are the organizations, particularly anti-carceral feminist organizations, that exist without funding at all to get to their communities and use creative strategies and tactics in order to reach people and end violence, right, without relying on violence, right? You can't call in a violence worker and say that you are anti-violence. That's not, it doesn't work that way, right? You know, much like wars don't end violence. So if you take that kind of concept of you know, structural violence and you embed that in thinking about ending interpersonal violence, you're doing the same project as thinking about home as prison. And when you meet these two kind of ways of thinking, you get to more creative ways of reaching people, right? Reaching through a community level, reaching through more creative kind of means of organizing, rather than thinking through how do I get money to stop people from doing X, Y, and Z, right? And what kinds of state funds or you know, blood-soaked funds can I appreciate in order to you know, to do these things that I want to do, right? To see a world that I want to see. You think instead on the community level, and I mean, much like what Claudia Jones was doing here, you even find sources, right? You find sources of funding that is community or crowd-based, and you move away from some of those kind of compromises that many do in the type of organizing that you're saying, anti-violence that relates on kind of, you know, the state funding, or, you know, what is it to take money from an abuser in order to save someone who's being abused, right? So if you start kind of thinking in that way, and you do kind of a kind of grander refusal to engage then I think you get to a purer sense of what anti-violence can and should be. Hope that makes any ounce of sense.
Right. We're getting to 5 o'clock, so I think it's time to thank you, Sem, for an incredible start to the academic year. And I'm sure those of us who didn't get to ask our questions yet will be coming to your office when you're back from your next talk.
Thank you, Anka.
So will you join me in thanking